This episode follows as part two of a special interview with Dr. Alan Rozanski. You will find part one in episode 192 called Beyond Physical Health, a cardiologist's whole person guide to wellness for highly sensitive people. If you haven't listened to the other episode yet, Dr. Rozanski has been a cardiologist and researcher in mind body medicine for over 40 years. He has co authored over 300 peer reviewed medical articles and book chapters, many of which are regarded as seminal contributions in the field of medicine. During his long tenure at Mount Sinai Morningside and Mount Sinai West Hospitals in New York City, he has served as professor of medicine, director of nuclear cardiology, and the leader of the Cardiology Fellowship Training Program. He also previously served as chief of cardiology. Dr. Rozanski brings a unique and holistic view of health. In the last episode, we gave an overview of Dr. Rozanski's 6 domains of health, and we dove a little deeper into the domain of physical health. Today, we will look more closely at some of the other 5 domains of health: mental vitality, emotional mastery, social connectivity, purposeful living, and stress management. And as we are diving into this, we'll see how far we go, and we may even break it up into another episode. So we're going to take our time and really enjoy the content that Dr. Rozanski has to offer here. So I'm grateful to have you back with us today, Dr. Rozanski. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you. My pleasure to be with you again. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're so welcome. It's just great to connect, and it's just an exciting area to explore with you. So, since we already have a good overview of the 6 domains of health from the last episode, and we also looked at physical health, which is the first domain, let's dive in and look at some of the other domains. And in each of these, we'll be looking at 2 main things again: the main research that provides evidence that the domain is important, as well as some practical things we can do to improve health in that domain. So I think the next in order of your the way you've set it up is mental vitality. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay, so tell me a little bit about mental vitality and what that means in relation to health.
Sure. Well, anytime you get into the brain and to thinking and so forth, you got to be careful to define your terms because there's so many ways we can look at the complexity of how we think and so forth. So basically, the way I think of it is that mental vitality is the characteristic of the way you think, your mindsets and so forth, and how that promotes your sense of well-being, your happiness, your attitudes, your behaviors. But also to think of the brain kind of like a muscle in a way. It's not a muscle, obviously, it's the collection of neural systems. But, we find that the brain works better when we attend to making sure we get enough rest, when we protect our focus, and when we nurture the variety that the brain likes to have. So that's also an aspect of that. So I break it up into those 2 parts. Now, why would I, as a cardiologist, be interested in, mental vitality? So we go back to, well, what's the evidence that it's a health domain? So here
Right.
it's pretty profound. First of all, we see going back now, I'd say generations, that there's something about cardiologists who look at the head and the body, and the mind and the
Yes.
soul, or the mind and the heart, however you want to look at it. There's a tradition of people who influenced me and so forth. And so it's kind of interesting. In fact, the earliest work on personality and and a lot of these areas was by 2 people, Roseman and Friedman, who developed something called the type A behavior pattern, which was something years ago that people all knew what type A is and type B is. And proposed that type A people were people who were competitive. They had a sense of time urgency, and there was a certain level of hostility that could be brought out in these people. So these were like hard driving people. And their initial research, they found that these people were more prone to heart disease. Now, this was a certain complexity that when people looked at it over time, it did not hold true. So it's
Mhm.
kind of been kind of abandoned. But the pattern of looking at hostility and chronic anger did pan out over time. When people just looked at that specific mindset, then that was important in terms of people having a higher risk for heart disease and other medical conditions. So that was the
Okay.
beginning. But the big breakthrough was when people began to look at optimism versus pessimism. Why
Okay.
that? First of all, by folklore, people have always been interested in the concept of hope and people who look at the glass half filled versus half empty. But the medical world didn't begin to look at this till around the year 2000. So it's really kind of a new field. And it was spurred by Dr. Seligman, in part, where he started to look at optimism and pessimism in terms of one's explanatory speaking style, how they explained events as being pervasive or being temporary, and so forth. But over time, it gravitated into more looking at it as a certain characteristic thinking pattern, and we were able to develop, not me, I mean, the researchers, a scale. It's called actually the life orientation test. And a revised version of that had 6 basic items about optimism versus pessimism, asking, for example, in uncertain times, I usually expect the best, or I'm always optimistic about the future, or on the pessimistic side, if something can go wrong for me, it will, or I hardly ever expect things to go well for me. So it's like a 6 point scale. Well, it turns out that this scale has been very reproducible over time. When you give people this scale, you find that people who score low on optimism, high on pessimism, have a higher rate of heart disease and a higher rate of all cause mortality. Now, this has been
Wow.
shown in younger people, older people across countries. A meta-analysis showed that there was a very substantial size effect in terms of this mindset. So this opens up. Wait a second. It's not just that thinking affects my quality of life and how I do, but it can actually affect my health. And
Wow. Yeah, that's
mechanisms have been worked out. A lot of it is the effect that, and I think we discussed this on the first podcast, when you look at all these domains of health that are not physical, they all affect the physical. In other words, people who are pessimistic, who are lonely, people who have a low sense of purpose, chronically stressed, they have poor health habits, are less likely to exercise, more likely to go for the quick fix, and so forth. So that's one of the profound ways in which it affects health. And the other is actually direct physiological effects when you have a high level of negative thought patterns and negative emotions and so forth. So those are the mechanisms by which this becomes an important health domain and becomes a
wow.
target for improving the quality of your health as opposed to the quality of just your lifestyle.
Yeah, yeah. I can see so clearly the connection between the body and the mind here, like
Right.
we're talking about optimism versus pessimism and and we know it has an effect. Psychologically, we kind of feel it in everyday life,
Yeah.
but to see that it actually affects your heart health and your overall health, not a, and also integrates with the other domains and can mess them up or can improve them if it's in a good place. So yeah, this is very interesting. So any other kinds of research that's been done on mental vitality versus as it affects the
Oh, well,
body?
sure. If you take these factors, let's say, and it's hard to study the other mindsets. For example, we don't have a good mindset on people who feel a high level of regret. I think that there's a tendency in some people to have excessive worry, excessive rumination, excessive regret, perfectionism. These are harder things to develop reliable scales for. But we see that when we look, for example, people who are pessimistic, there's a much higher, or they should say higher, but that's what, in proportion to the magnitude of risk for depression over time. So a ruminator is somebody who would be at increased risk for depression. And then depression itself is a tremendous risk factor for illness. We find that when people get depressed, well, actually, just about every physiological system of the body begins to go haywire. You start to develop more insulin resistance, autonomic dysfunction, The brain changes adversely in its plasticity. You get enlargement of the amygdala and actually some shrinkage of the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex, and immunological dysfunction and a much higher risk for heart disease and so forth. So not just looking at these factors in terms of their effects on heart outcomes, but looking at what leads to depression and so forth is also a clue as to what's a health factor. But we have to emphasize the opposite. And this was not done for a long time. That when you look at the other end of the scale, people who are happier actually have better health outcomes. They have more resilience. They suffer less heart disease and so forth. So we want to work on being more happy or being more with more positive emotions and decrease the opposite. And so that has intrigued me for many years. And over time, I've thought about how can we develop practical ways to help people on this that become more than just someone going, let's say, to a therapist. What can the individual do to work with this in terms of improving their own lifestyles?
Yeah, great. So, what conclusions have you come to of what could be effective to help people move towards optimism, towards happiness, and maybe less in the depression or pessimistic side?
Sure. So, just as background, when we look at people's thinking patterns, and I venture into this with a little bit of caution because there's so many ways to divide how we think and so forth. But I think people would agree that, first of all, there's a certain temperament that people have. It tends to be genetic. Anybody who's had two or more children will realize that. One child
Mm.
tends to be more calm, another more agitated, or more a bit different personality types that these people have, that kids have. And it's so I know someone who has 13 kids and said to me, it's amazing how every single one of them is different. But
Amazing. Yeah.
everyone knows that uncovering the temperament that a child has. And then
Right.
on top of that, you overlay a person's personality, which is a little bit broader, but pretty consistent with people too, right? That one person may be open minded, another less open minded. A certain person is more conscientious than another person. Another person's more humorous. Some people tend to be more calm. Some people very sensitive. We're talking about highly sensitive people, right? This is kind of like in the personality of a person. And then you have a person's character. So you're going up the scale here. That's also pretty stable in people. Definitely more malleable. As we go up the scale, there's things that are more malleable. So,
Hmm.
our character traits involve also behaviors we've modeled, let's say, based on people who've influenced us, or that we've taken by choice, and include things like compassion, integrity, patience. These may be in things of definite choices you made in life to develop something in terms of a moral bent or in terms of a compassionate bent, and that is cooked into a person, can be changed, but there's things that we associate with people in terms of their character. And then you get to the area of mindsets, which are, the attitudes and beliefs that people have, which through which they filter how they look at life and how they behave and how they feel.
Mm.
So optimism versus pessimism, in other words, the ability to look at things that half full as half empty, that's a mindset. Um, Gratitude is a big one, right? It's a way you can work on things. There's many types of mindsets. So I differentiate these between cognitive mindsets and more deep-seated thought patterns, if you will. The
Okay.
cognitive mindset is an area where I got work to do in this area, but I have to think about it intellectually and so forth, and I have to be consistent to change it. But still, it's something which is cognitive. It's on a conscious level. It's on an intellectual level. But when you get into more deep seated mindsets, let's say someone who's a ruminator, someone who worries excessively, someone who feels regretful excessively, this is where I think you have to say you have to go under the hood, because these
Mm.
things, these mindsets tend to be uh, working in the subconscious, more automatic, more deep seated with a lot of emotional overlay. So there
Absolutely.
you have more work to do. So when you take that differentiation, I'll give you an analogy from my work as a cardiologist, and something I've had to work out over time is how do we approach people? Let's say you want to go from being sedentary to being physically active, but they are not there. And if I'm going to just tell a patient, well, here's the guidelines: 30 minutes, 5 times a week. That's what the guidelines say. Good luck,
Just
because
do it.
what happens when people shut down because they don't feel they can do that. So,
Right.
a smart cardiologist will work with the patient in terms of what we call self-efficacy. What's the thing that you think you can change? Begin with the easy and get on the playing field. So, if you
Mm,
think of what I just said, temperaments, personality, character traits, deep-seated thinking patterns, and cognitive mindsets, the easiest place to start is with cognitive mindsets. And you say,
mhm.
what are things that I don't have a lot of resistance to, but I'm not there yet with it, but I want to change it, and begin with that. And then you
Yeah.
begin what I call, mindset work. You begin to change something and you feel better and you start to feel, wait, I'm learning things about how to change my mindsets. I'm learning the concept of reframing. I'm learning the concept of, you know, being aware of my thinking and catching myself in the moment and saying, wait, I have a choice to keep thinking like this or change it.
Mhm.
And then you can build out from that. So that's kind of how I approach that.
I love it. Yeah, you're working with the most malleable part first
Exactly.
and getting some wins,
Yes.
and then you can go deeper
Yes.
as
Yes.
interest increases.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So, okay, so you mentioned reframing, you mentioned, I can't remember what else. If you
Oh,
like,
well,
I'm sure.
there's many things to do. It's
Okay.
let's take gratitude for example.
Okay.
If I'm going to start with a mindset, I would start with gratitude because generally
Mm,
speaking, nobody has a resistance to the concept. Everybody
good point.
understands intellectually that, this is good, you know, but it's not so easy. Oh, and it's profound in terms of you really get there. In other words, what I mean by mindset, it's not just I feel grateful if someone does something for me, but I've become a grateful personality. It's in my background.
Mm,
I naturally
mm,
feel grateful. That's what we want to get to. But it's not easy. And I'll tell you, it's not easy for me. I mean, I've done, work on gratitude for a while, and on the scale, somewhere in the middle, and
okay.
that's having talked about it and cherished it,
Yes.
so it
It's a
isn't so
process,
simple.
right?
But what I mean when you do mindset work is you first have to work out, why do I want to take this on? Why is this important? So when you think about gratitude, you have to define it. You have to say, what do I mean by gratitude? Yes, it's feeling an appreciation for the good things in my life, or feeling appreciation for what someone has done for me. But you have to go deeper. And I think one of the tools for it is to understand, what is the opposite of gratitude? The opposite of gratitude is a sense of entitlement, that I feel
Mm,
entitled to the things I have. I feel entitled to my health. Of course, my eyes will work fine. My ears, I can walk fine. I don't have any shoulder pain. Do we feel grateful for it? We are built in to take what we have for granted. And that's not a knock on us. It's just the way we're built. I mean, think
yeah.
about it. If you have a young child, you see that they have no perspective on what to be grateful for. But I was thinking about it. So, what changes at age 10 or 20? I mean, where are we doing that work on gratitude? We continue to take our blessings for granted until we experience contrast.
Yeah.
So that's one of the aspects. Another challenge to it is Dennis Prager wrote a book he called Happiness is a Serious Problem. And in it, he has
Hmm.
a chapter called The Missing Tile Syndrome. What's that? He says, let's say you went into the Palace of Versailles, and it's an amazing sight to see all the gilded, staircases, the old furniture. But he said, let's say you walk in there, but you'd see a tile missing on the ceiling. He says, where would your eyes go right away to
Of
what's
course.
missing? We're kind of built that way. But here's
Yeah.
the thing: if you think about the entitlement and say, "Wait a second, was I really entitled to get into the city quickly today when I was driving?" If a traffic accident occurred and the everything got
Right.
backed up, how are you going to feel? You're going to feel frustrated. You're going to feel resentful. Why did this
Yes.
happen? But what about the other 99 times when you got into the city right away? You don't feel grateful for that. The work of
Right.
gratitude is to say, what am I feeling entitled to? And then flip the switch and say, wait a second, what should I feel grateful for? And see as a gift. Oh, wait a second. I got to see that my health is a gift. That the
Yeah.
fact that my eyes are working fine, that I don't have any arthritis or, other thing going on, and feel that that's a gift. Now that is where to go, and the payoff is tremendous because it is, I think, the most assured way to start to feel happy and resilient. You have perspective in life, and I think we all have a certain level of that, but we can go much further with that. What's the challenge? A, you got to work it out. B, there's a certain consistency and persistence you have to do with it. Many of us have tried gratitude, exercise before. Last year, I started a WhatsApp with my family, and
Mm.
we said, okay, every day we're each going to WhatsApp one thing we were grateful for, and we did it for a couple months, and we were liking it. Well, the third month it started to fall, and in the fourth month it was gone.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you got to come back to it. Don't get
Right.
discouraged from it. But the problem is gratitude is in that domain that we call quadrant two. I think we talked about that, but if we didn't, with things that
Yeah.
are important but not urgent, and we're always falling back into what's more immediate, what's more urgent. So
Right.
you have to have a good deal of intentionality, and you can then work on mindset. So mindsets is where I would begin in terms of this. And there's many types of mindsets. You have mindsets about how you manage your time. You have mindsets about how you want to be in terms of. I distinguish between Teflon and Velcro. Do you want to be more of a Teflon personality or a Velcro personality? Do you want to be a person
Mm.
that things can bounce off of you and or things stick to you? So I think we want to be more Teflon, but then you have to say, well, wait a second, what's the mindset work I need to do to get there, and what are steps that I can work on to improve myself 1% and then
Yeah.
2% and then go from there.
I love it. I love it. Yeah. I really appreciated when you said that the opposite of grateful is entitled,
Right,
because I hadn't really thought of that before, but that is absolutely correct.
right,
And we just take something for granted, and then there's no gratitude for it. It's just automatic. So
right,
I love that as a starting place for a kind of practice where what am I feeling and what am I just taking for granted here?
right.
What am I feeling entitled about? And then could I actually put my attention and say and find gratitude for that? It's a real turnaround of sorts that could really I could see that really being a valuable practice.
Absolutely.
And so yeah, I think this is a rich area. It also touches on some of the work that I love to do, which I it's called the work of Byron Katie, where we actually start with sometimes stressful situations and find what's good about them. Actually, it's kind of and it's a process, and it does tap into kind of feelings and almost unconscious a bit, but it can shift the perspective, it can reframe, and it can open the mind a lot. But whether it really doesn't matter what practice you do, it's the idea of shifting attention from one side to the other side. And I love that this can be something to put attention on. I think it's something that if we do it can actually have a impact on not only our feeling of vitality but on our physical health.
Well, what you say about Byron Katie and this concept of what can I find good in stress, which is a very profound concept, and maybe when we talk about the overall domain of stress management, we'll get into that in more detail. But it immediately brings to mind what I think is an important mindset, which is related to that concept, which is what I'd call making meaning mindset. In other words, that you can choose to take things which seem just like a frustration or something that occurred and say, wait a second, I can choose to make some meaning out of this. I'll tell you a story, very interesting story, because it was kind of recent in my mind. My son called me. He had gone from his school he was going to go with his wife to a wedding, and he leaves and he finds his car's missing. Can't find it. Look, he's sure where he parked it. After about 5, 10 minutes, he calls the police, and then he figure out that his car had been towed because the registration had expired. Now it was flagged because he actually parked his car in a place which was not legal. Okay, but
Okay.
anyway, he called me because he was very frustrated. So how did I respond? Because he was calling for some consolation and so forth. So remarkably, something similar to that occurred to me about, oh gosh, this goes back almost 30 years ago. What happened was I was moving from Los Angeles to New York, and I had to find an apartment within 2 weeks before my job started. And after a few days, I figured, oh, I wanted a West Side apartment, near the Hudson River. And I was looking for, a good view place, not something that was going to just overlook another building.
Mm.
And after all, I'd been in a beautiful place in Los Angeles. So then in one morning, I went and I found this apartment that was on the 12th floor overlooking the Hudson River. But I'd heard also of another apartment overlooking Central Park, and I was very curious about that. And this apartment had been on the block for a few weeks because the doorman had told me that. And I walked over to the other apartment, saw it wasn't appropriate, and walked right back, and it was gone. Someone had walked in during that 25, 30 minutes and taken the apartment. And I ended up in an apartment facing, a whatever. So anyway, I called up a dear friend, someone I looked up to as a role model, because I was very, very angry with myself and
Sure.
disappointed. And he said to me, "Well, just make sure you get your tuition's worth from the experience." And I have to tell you, when he said that, I didn't know what he was talking about. I didn't feel consoled by it, but somehow it stuck in my brain. Get your tuition's worth from it. I didn't come to the realization till later that, wait a second, this is a way to look at something that happened. Okay, this happened. Oh man, I don't know what it's going to be, but I'm determined to get my tuition's worth from this.
Mm.
And then I learned that I started to integrate that into my life prospectively. When things wouldn't go well, I'd say, well, either I'd look for some meaning in it, or I would think about using it as motivation to create meaning. So
Yeah.
now when my son called me, of course sympathized what happened, but I told him, please make sure you get your tuition's worth from this situation. So he
Hmm.
said, what are you talking about? Now, when I'd called this mentor years earlier, he hadn't kind of explained it to me, but I'd worked it out in my head and I explained it to my son. And I hope he will use it prospectively. So that is the concept of meaning making. It became a mindset in my mind, but it didn't come overnight. It came by working on it, and reaching out to this person was an example of something I also do as a mindset, that I look for help. I look to reach out to people when I feel like something's not making sense, when I'm feeling more frustrated or anxious than I think I should feel, and so forth.
Mm.
So it's very simple, similar to this, finding the good in a stressful. Maybe it's
Yeah.
the same thing. Actually,
Yeah.
I think it's the
Yeah.
same
Good
thing,
one.
right? Yeah,
I think so. I think so. Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
exactly.
yeah, yeah,
It
yeah.
doesn't have to look a particular way to
Yeah,
be the same essence.
same concept.
So
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yes, yeah.
Okay, great. So this, I'm sure there's more. Obviously, we could probably spend a lifetime in this one domain alone. Mental vitality is super important,
Right,
and there's a lot that can be done. Is there
right.
anything else you'd like
Yeah,
to
I
add
think
before
I
we
think
can?
we should come back to the other side of it, because I
Okay.
mentioned there's a side to it where you're treating the brain like a muscle,
Okay. Yeah. Let's
and
talk
what
about
you
that.
want to do there is you want to think about, first of all, making sure that you protect your ability to focus. We live in a generation where that has become an issue in a way it hasn't been before because we can get easily distracted. We could call it the scrolling generation and so forth. And, we're always getting pop ups, we're always getting texts. People can get at us many different ways. And also, multitasking has become popular. And yet, when we can focus and tune out the distractions, we have more peace of mind in a sense, because peace of mind isn't just about not having worry and so forth. Peace of mind is also letting the mind do its work without the distractions. And the
Yeah.
analogy I use is between a laser and a incandescent light. See, lasers are, one monochrome, right? It's green or blue. It's
Coherent.
very
Yeah.
focused, and it can cut through tissue, right? And condensate light is all of the different parts, and it provides light, but it doesn't have that energetic ability. And that's the value of focus. So you really have to work on your focus, protecting that, and say, wait a second, how can I, you know, create zones of time where I'm not going to be interrupted, and the techniques are obvious. For example, turning off your cell phone, there's many different things that people can do. So I don't think we need to run through that. So that's number one. Number two is the mind kind of likes variety. When we are doing the same thing all day long, what happens is we start to lose steam. And
Hmm.
very often we don't understand that we're losing the steam. It's not like, a muscles that are working out and you can't do it anymore. You're running, you can't do it anymore. We start to lose the steam, but we don't necessarily notice it. So the mind thrives on variety, coming, you know, to do different things. Now, we can understand that easily. Let's say you're doing some work, cognitive work in your job. It doesn't mean that variety has to be that all of a sudden you're turning on music or whatever. It turns if you can change your focus to something else, let's say something you enjoy, something that you've wanted to work on that isn't part of your job, or maybe you're writing a journal or something, and just changing your focus makes your mind more energetic again. Then you can come back to the
Mm.
first thing. So you have to think about, in
Mhm.
terms of your day, how to build in some variety in terms of the things you're doing. And then the mind
Yeah.
needs rest too. We have limited willpower and so forth. And so people are high performers. All these different techniques have now been developed where I'm going to work for 45 minutes hard or 90 minutes, but I'm going to have a 10-minute break and then go back. But sleep is a paradigm there too, right? I mean, we don't think as good as when we don't sleep well, sometimes a strategic nap. So people have to realize for themselves what their what works for them, and but make sure that you protect your focus, that you are having some variety built into your day, and that you give your mind some rest. So those are things to nurture mental vitality as well.
Fantastic. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I really see the contrast now between the positive mindset work and that kind of work we were talking about at first, and then just strengthening the muscle, if you will, providing the right environment for the mind to thrive, which is taking care of it. Right. It doesn't do well when there's multitasking. I for one, I have worked with a mentor some years ago, and he just said, "Turn off all your notifications and pop-ups on your computer," and I did it, and it's just like it's wonderful. I'm just focused during the time that I'm focused.
Absolutely,
But I love the idea of breaks,
absolutely,
and I'm thinking you can even throw in the physical breaks like that exercise snack idea that you mentioned.
absolutely, absolutely,
A little
absolutely.
variety in your day, and it also takes care of the physical.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
really cool, really cool.
yeah.
Okay, so let's look at the next domain then. So I think that one is emotional mastery. Is that right?
Emotional mastery. Yes.
Okay. So what do you mean by that, and how is that different from mental vitality?
Well, there's a tremendous amount of overlap because our thoughts lead to a lot of emotions, but it's bidirectional. Our emotions can also affect our thinking, and our emotions are often biophysical. There was Robert Thayer was a psychologist who, in the 1970s, did very classic work. He took individuals. In those days, they didn't have some of the sophisticated tools we have today. But he had these individuals wear beepers. And at the time that the beeper went off, people had to record what they were doing, what they were feeling, and what their energy level was. Like how energetic did they feel and the tension level. And what he
Mm.
looked at is this was kind of like rough, but he divided people into times when they reported being calm and energetic, calm and tired, tense and energetic, or tense energy, and tense and tired.
Okay.
And when he looked at the other aspects here, what were they doing at the time and how were they feeling? He found that the majority of, let's say, what we'd call quick fix behaviors, in terms of like reaching for the cigarette or a candy bar, turning on television, all that kind of stuff, occurred when people were feeling both tense and tired.
Mm.
Okay. So then the question is, how did people feel when they were tense and energetic? Did it look more like calm and energetic, or did it look more like tense and tired?
Okay.
And what he found was, lo and behold, that when you were tense but energetic, you were doing pretty good. You maybe there was a little more tension, but you were doing all the quick fix behaviors and not much of it and so forth. So in other words, it turns out that energy trumps tension. In other words, we
Mm.
handle our emotions better, we handle our frustrations better when we feel energetic. Okay, so this is
Yeah.
profound because you think about sometimes when a problem is looming. When do you want to solve it most is also when you're feeling you know, uh, down from it, down and out,
Mm. Yeah.
And that sometimes the role there is to say, wait a second, maybe I shouldn't trust my thinking so much now because I'm in a more constricted place and I'm more
Yeah.
likely to be more touchy and less patient and so forth. Let me get to a better place. Good night's rest and so forth. Don't have an argument with your partner late at night when you're not up for it. It's not the best
Right.
time,
Right. Right.
So, at least in my opinion. So this is an example where there's the bidirectionality of our thinking and our emotions. It's not just our thinking affects our emotions, but it can go the other way as well.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, when you compare, like, would you say that that calm, calm and energetic would be the ideal place to be in, or is it just to understand, like, tense and energetic is not too bad? Is kind of what I'm saying, like, what I'm hearing, as opposed to tense and not energetic. Tense and tired is probably the least
I use this as
favorable
a
state.
general paradigm for the principle I just was trying to explain.
Okay.
Calm and energetic is a very pleasurable state for people. It's kind of comparable to this whole concept of flow,
Yep.
where people get into something that they're doing that's in their zone without distractions. Time stops, and they feel like they could be doing that forever. Flow and calm energy is not the same thing per se, but there's an analogy between the two of them. In other words,
Okay.
there's this really feel good feeling when we're feeling calm and energetic. But life isn't like that. Life is
Right.
full of all the things we have to do during the day, and there's often a lot of tension and so forth. So part of it is working on our energy level. And by the way, this is why what you eat and whether you're exercising and feeling fit and getting enough sleep is all important because you're keeping your energy level up. And energy is
Yeah.
important. And also paying attention to the cues of your body, So say, wait a second, I got to go through this thing, but you know what? I really would benefit from 15 minutes of a break or a power nap or things like
Yeah.
that. So that's one of the tools in terms of emotional mastery. So emotional mastery is really about using our emotions in the way that they can really serve us instead of us being dominated by our emotions. So it's, in other words, being able to get into more positive mindsets, being able to deal with negative mindsets, being able to shorten the duration of a negative mindset because we're generally better when we're in a positive. state of emotional well-being, but it's
Yeah.
also using emotions to connect with people and to enrich relationships. So there's many aspects to emotional mastery, but overall, there's a lot of tools to develop and use in terms of becoming that master.
Okay. Okay. So, um, tell me if you about some of those tools. What have you found to be useful, or what
Yeah,
have you seen to be
yeah.
useful?
So again, here you can go from easier to more difficult and so forth. But just as we might promulgate being aware of our thinking as giving us choice into how we want to manipulate our thinking, you know, the people often are so busy during the day that they're not aware of the emotions they're in. They're not aware that their anger's bubbling up, or they're feeling more frustrated, or they're feeling a bit down, and they're just
Mhm.
accepting it and saying, wait a second, this emotions are information. They provide us with clues in terms of how our overall being is feeling and doing. But when we're so distracted, when we're so into the things we're doing, we often just let it be in the background instead of being the information that could be used. So part of this is learning just to be able to stop and be aware of your emotions. It's a whole
Mhm.
talent you have to develop. And again, you start with 1%. Start with, just say, hey, wait, I'm going to even just set your cell phone to go off at 4 p.m. or maybe twice a day and say, hey, how am I feeling right now? And get into the practice of noticing how you're feeling. Okay.
Got it.
Once you have
Yeah.
awareness of your thoughts or your emotions, now you have a say so in whether you want to deal with that. Now,
Right.
one of the absolute key traits for anybody dealing either with when we're talking about mindset work or in terms of emotional mastery is the ability to reframe, learning how to reframe, which is being, which has levels to it. The first level of reframing, well, reframing is something that is a huge part, for example, of cognitive behavioral therapy, that therapists are using, and it's a very
Yep.
powerful technique, but it's something available to all of us, and we don't need to go to a therapist to learn it. If sometimes you do, sometimes, particularly if it's a significantly entrenched thinking or emotional pattern that you're having trouble dealing with, as I mentioned, rumination, or people who are suffering from a high degree of perfectionism or worry or things like that. But basically, the first level in dealing with reframing is to just recognize, wait, catch your thinking, catch your emotions, and say, wait a second, the thoughts I'm having at the moment are just the thoughts I'm having. It's not necessarily reality. It's just
Yeah.
the way I'm thinking. See, so
Right.
often we are more prone to thinking it is the way I'm thinking, that's how things are.
That's it.
No, it is your thinking. Yeah, and a lot of it is things you're very sure of and are correct. If there's principles that can guide us. But a lot of our thinking is things that we're thinking which are not necessarily so, but we live in terms of it as reality. So you want to
Right.
develop the muscle which says, hey, wait a second. Number one is I realize that this is just the way I'm thinking. Number two is to then say, can I reframe this in another way?
Yep.
Now, when you're not used to it, reframing is like trying to swing at a baseball when you're a 7 or 8 year old. You're not necessarily so good at it at first, but you keep coming back to it every day. You get better at it. So you want to
Yeah.
develop the ability to just say, I can create other reframes for this.
Yep.
So you
Yep.
do that. Then the third step is now of these reframes, what's a credible reframe? In other words, you
Yeah.
learn how to reframe, but now you say, what sounds credible? This feels like this could be true. It's like
Uh,
when you're shooting the ball at the basket, and this one went in. I know
right.
this one's going to go in because it's credible. So it's just we develop that over time. We learn how to reframe certain things. And we all learn how to do this better as we get older. This is one of the reasons why older people are wiser people, because you've learned through life experience to see things in a way you didn't used to see them,
Yeah.
and you've learned to reframe things and let things bounce off of you in a way when your younger self couldn't do it, but we can take this on as a practice, and that's one way to develop emotional mastery, because as you develop, you replace negative thoughts with positive thoughts, then you've, you know, created negative emotions that follow them with positive ones, you know.
That's it. That's it.
Taking that one step further is to say, you know, what are the negative emotional generators in my life? We all have one or more of those areas. Everybody deals with
Yeah.
something, either a tendency to worry, be pessimistic, to be regretful or whatever. And this is where often you have to go under the hood and you have to see what is there underneath here that is a pattern that I get stuck in this. And very often here you do need the help of somebody else. Again, not necessarily a therapist, but someone wiser, a mentor, someone who can work through the areas where you're stuck. But
Mm.
just to identify this is an area I have to work on and move it from quadrant two, which is something in the future, to something that I want to work now. And what's something I can put into even my calendar that I'm going to work on this is a way to deal with this. Working on even being aware of, let's say, certain things that trigger you to get into a negative emotional pattern. Well, there's utility in understanding that and to avoid the trigger, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it's so that works for some people. Some people journaling helps. In other words, emotions are raw and they're free floating. The minute you begin to journal and you bring your intellect into the emotion, you're cooling off the emotion.
Yep.
So
Yep.
that's interesting. And then I
That
would
is. Yep.
say the role, all of the things coming back to last week, all of the physical pillars of health, exercise, resistance training, diet, and sleep are great ways to help deal with your emotions as well. If you
Mm.
look at exercise, it's profound. The data, my friend Jim Blumenthal was the creator of three randomized prospective studies, NIH sponsored studies, where they took people with depression and they randomized them to an exercise training program versus receiving an antidepressant. And they followed them over the course of 12 weeks. And it was reproducible in all three studies that you had a
Wow.
comparable reduction in depression with exercise and with the use of an antidepressant medication. Now, that's not to say that there isn't a role for antidepressant medication, and these were controlled studies. So there's always, you have to be careful to analogize, but there's a lot of studies that show that if you look within communities, there's a lower rate of depression among people who are physically active. If you look at longitudinal studies, there's also evidence that shows that people who were exercising over time developed a lower rate of depression.
Hmm.
There's a new field called nutritional psychiatry, which is beginning to look at the effects of nutrition on our emotions and so forth. And here I say, for a person, I find for myself, I am in a different mood sometimes based on what I eat.
Yeah.
So I've taken
Yeah.
cognizance of that. And I think that's pretty well accepted empirically. So work with that with yourself and notice and so forth. So that's a way to deal with emotions as well. And of course, sleep's a big one, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
That one I don't have to prove to anybody. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's like you can approach it from both sides. You can approach it from the physical side, and that helps emotion, or you can approach it from the mental side, and that helps emotion. You can let the emotions themselves guide you because they're information. Like these, I'm really starting to see how these domains are interconnected, and how improving one starts to improve the other, and it's just a matter of starting somewhere. I think more than anything.
That is bingo. That is exactly right. It's to separate the body from the mind and the emotions and these other domains of health is a very reductionist way to understand how we operate. You can't separate them. So, if we embrace that they're interrelated, it gives you tools to work on any one of these domains and it gives you entree points to all of this. So, that's exactly correct.
Yeah, I like you said earlier, just get on the playing field.
Yeah,
You know,
playing field.
just to get started in something, can get the ball rolling.
That's correct. That's how you build 1% improvement, and that's why I
Yeah,
started off back with mental vitality, breaking that up the way I did, so that to get at the most malleable part, which were cognitive mindsets,
yeah,
and then
yeah,
and that becomes fun then because you see, wait, there's an area I can change, and now I can improve from there.
absolutely. Okay, so that covers a couple more domains: mental vitality and emotional mastery. And I think we'll break here. And then that leaves us social connectivity, purposeful living, and stress management for another episode.
Thank you so
So
much.
thanks again for being here, Dr. Rozanski. It's just, I love hearing your perspective, not only as a human being, but also as a cardiologist and as a researcher. It's like the uniqueness of all three of those together is very compelling. So thank
Thank you
you.
so much. Thank you. Thank you very much.